Welcome to Sleepy Harbour. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head, and let the room go soft and dim around you. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to do, except breathe slowly and listen to a quiet voice tell you a long, old story. You do not have to follow every word. You do not have to remember any of it. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that is not a failure. That is exactly what this is for. The story will keep going gently in the dark, the way a tide keeps moving, whether or not anyone is watching it, and you can simply let it carry you out. So let us begin far from the beginning, on a spring evening in a crowded hall, with an old man standing with his back to a room full of people. It is the 7th of May in the year 1824 in the city of Vienna. Inside a theatre lit by candles and oil lamps, an enormous piece of music has just come to its end. For more than an hour the orchestra has been playing, the singers have been singing. The sound has been swelling up toward the painted ceiling and pressing against the walls, and now, in the last moment, it has all crashed to a stop, and the room has erupted. People are on their feet. Hands are clapping so hard and so fast that the applause becomes a single roar, a wall of noise, the kind of sound you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. Handkerchiefs, hats, arms, all of it lifted and waving. It is one of those rare nights when a crowd forgets itself entirely. And at the front of that room, close to the orchestra, there is a short, heavy-set man with wild grey hair, and he is facing the wrong way. He is still turned toward the musicians. He is still moving his hands, still beating out the time, still turning as if there were more music to shape, more pages to bring to life. He does not turn around. He does not bow. He simply keeps working at a piece that has already finished, because he has no idea that it has finished, because he cannot hear a single sound of the thunder breaking behind his back. That man is Ludwig van Beethoven, and the music that has just ended is his Ninth Symphony, his Symphony No. 9 in D minor, the one that would eventually carry, in its final movement, the melody the whole world would come to know as the Ode to Joy. He has written it, every note of it. He has built this colossal thing, this ocean of sound with human voices rising out of it, and he cannot hear any of it. And he cannot hear the roar of thanks the city of Vienna is throwing at his back. Somewhere in the confusion, one of the singers steps toward him. The name that has come down to us is Caroline Unger, a young contralto, one of the soloists who had lifted her voice in that finale. And she does a small, tender thing that has echoed through 200 years. She takes him, gently, and she turns him around. She turns his whole body so that his eyes can finally do what his ears no longer can, so that he can see it. The standing crowd, the waving hands, the open mouths, the faces streaked and shining. He sees the ovation he was never going to hear. Hold that picture for a moment in the quiet of your room. An old man, turned by a kind hand, discovering with his eyes the love that his ears had already lost forever. That is where we are going tonight. Not straight there. We will wander slowly the way you wander through a large house at night with a single lamp, opening one door and then another. But that image, the turned body, the seen applause, is the far shore of this story. And everything we walk through will be, in some quiet way, walking toward it. Because the question underneath that image is the one that keeps this whole strange life so haunting. How do you write music you cannot hear? How does a man build a symphony out of instruments and voices he will never physically listen to? Imagine the exact sound of 100 people making music together. And then be right? How does the sound get inside a head that the world of sound has left? And beneath even that question, there is a quieter, sadder one. Why? Why did it happen to him, of all people? Why did the ears of the greatest listener of his age slowly close, note by note, high sound first, until nothing was left but silence and a ringing that never stopped? We will not pretend to have neat answers to all of it. Part of the gentleness of an old mystery is that it stays a little open, and you are allowed to fall asleep before it is solved, because in truth it has never been entirely solved by anyone. But we can walk into it. We can hold the concrete, true, touchable pieces of it in our hands, one at a time, and let them be enough. So let me show you one of those pieces now, because it answers a little of the how, and because it is the kind of small, physical, human thing that most tellings of this life hurry past. Picture a piano, not a modern one, but one of the wooden instruments of his time, standing on 4 legs the way a table stands. Now picture those legs cut down, sawed off shorter, or removed altogether, so that the whole heavy body of the instrument sits low, close to the floorboards, almost resting on the ground. Beethoven did this. He had the legs of his pianos lowered so the instrument would sit nearer the floor, and he would put his ear or his body right against the wood of it while he played. Because sound, you see, is not only a thing you hear. Sound is movement. When a string is struck, it shivers, and that shiver travels through the wood, through the air, through anything solid it can reach. It is the same reason you can feel a lorry rumble past through the soles of your feet before it is loud, or feel music thumping through the floor of a room next door, even when the door is shut. The whole instrument was trembling with the notes, and if he could get his body close enough to the trembling wood, some of that shivering could reach him even when the sound in the air could not. And late in his life, when even that was slipping away, he went further. He took a thin wooden rod, a slender stick, and he clenched one end of it between his teeth, and he pressed the other end against the body of the piano while he played, so that the vibrations of the strings would travel up the rod, into his teeth, into his jaw, and up through the very bones of his skull, into whatever was left of his hearing. There is a name for this now. We call it bone conduction, the idea that sound can travel to the inner ear straight through the bones of the head, instead of through the open air. It is the same reason your own voice sounds strange and unfamiliar to you when you hear it played back on a recording, because usually you hear yourself partly through your skull, from the inside, a private sound no one else gets. Beethoven, biting down on a wooden stick with his eyes closed, was reaching for exactly that. Music, travelling up through his own bones. A man drinking sound through his teeth because the ordinary road for it had washed away. That is the how, in its plainest, most physical form. A sawed-off piano, a stick between the teeth, a body pressed to trembling wood. There is more to the how, and we will come to it slowly, the imagining he did entirely inside his mind, the notebooks he filled, the little trumpets a clever inventor made for his ears. But I wanted you to have that picture first, because it is honest, and it is quiet, and it undoes the cartoon. He did not simply defy his deafness by some magic of genius. He fought it with sawdust and wood and his own skull. He was practical about the impossible. Now, before we go back to the beginning of him, let me say one small thing to you directly, and then I will not interrupt the story again for a good long while. If you have found your way to this harbour before, and these slow tellings help you find your way down into sleep. It means a great deal that you keep coming back. And I always find myself curious in these late quiet hours about where in the world you are listening from tonight. What town, what country, what sort of dark is outside your window right now? If you feel like leaving a word about it, I do read them. And if you are new here and you would like more of these long, unhurried journeys into old stories, you are welcome to stay, welcome to subscribe, welcome to make this a place you return to when the mind will not settle on its own. That is all. Now let the world get older and smaller and quieter, and let us go back, past that spring night in Vienna, past the turned body and the scene applause, all the way to the very start of him, to a small city on a river, in the middle of winter, more than 50 years before that famous ovation. The city is Bonn, on the great river Rhine, in what was then the Electorate of Cologne, a small church-state ruled by a prince who was also an archbishop. It is the kind of place where a court, a household of musicians and servants and officials gathered around a ruler, sets the rhythm of a talented family's whole life. And it is here, in the deep cold of December, in the year 1770, that a baby is baptized in a church. The record of that baptism survives. It is dated the 17th of December, 1770. His exact birthday we do not actually know, which is a strange thing to say about one of the most famous people who ever lived, but it is true. In those days a child was often baptized the day after being born, so it has become the gentle tradition to say he was born on the 16th of December, the day before the record. But no one wrote the birth itself down, or if they did, the paper is long gone. So we have the christening, and from the christening we guess backward one day. And that is as close as history lets us stand to the beginning of Ludwig van Beethoven. Let us stay a moment on his name, because even the name carries a small, quiet story. Beethoven, van Beethoven. That little word, van, was Flemish, from the Low Countries to the northwest, from the family's roots there. It is not the same as the German word von, which sounds almost identical to the ear, but meant something very different. Von, in the German world, was the marker of nobility. The word that told everyone a person came from an aristocratic family, a family with land and a title and old blood. Van meant no such thing. It was just a common part of a Flemish surname, the way so many ordinary names carry little words like of or from tucked inside them. But the two words sounded so alike, and looked so alike on paper, that later in his life Beethoven was quietly content to let people wonder, to let the ambiguity sit there and do its work, to let strangers half assume that this proud, difficult musician might be some kind of gentleman by birth. He never quite claimed it, he never quite denied it. He simply let one small letter blur and let people fill in the rest. There is something very human in that, a man not lying exactly, but not rushing to correct a flattering mistake either. He was born into music the way some children are born into farming or the sea. It was the family trade. His grandfather, also named Ludwig, the man he was named after, had been a respected figure at that same electoral court in Bonn, a Kapellmeister, which is to say the master of the chapel, the person in charge of the music, the top musical post in that little world. To be the grandson of the Kapellmeister was to be somebody in the small pond of Bonn. It meant the name Beethoven already carried a certain weight in the court, already opened certain doors, already came with expectations hung around a child's neck before the child could walk. But between the grandfather and the grandson there was the father, and the father is where the story turns from warm to hard. His father was Johann, and Johann was a singer at the court, a tenor, a man whose voice was his living. By all accounts, his gift was modest, a decent voice, but not a great one, a working musician rather than a master. And Johann drank. Heavily. It is one of the quiet tragedies stitched into the beginning of this life, that the boy grew up in a house shadowed by a father's drinking, a father who had inherited a great musical name and could not quite live up to it, and who seems to have decided, as some struggling parents do, that the answer to his own disappointment lay in his son. Because there was, everyone could see, something in the boy, a real gift, a serious one, at the keyboard. And Johann looked at that gift, and he did not only see a child, he saw a way out. He saw money and glory. And most of all, he saw another child, from a few years earlier, whose fame had swept across Europe and made his own father rich and celebrated. He saw Mozart. You may know the story of the boy Mozart, the tiny prodigy carted from court to court across Europe, playing for empresses and kings, astonishing everyone, a small child producing music that grown masters could barely believe. That was the great glittering example, hanging over every musical family of the age, and Johann van Beethoven decided that his Ludwig would be the next one, that he would market his son the way you might market a marvel, a wonder, a spectacle. And here we come to a small, sad, telling detail. When Johann began to put his boy in front of paying audiences, he wanted the child to seem as astonishing as possible, and the younger a prodigy is, the more astonishing the world finds him. A gifted child of 6 is more of a miracle than a gifted child of 8. So on at least one early concert poster, one of those printed announcements pasted up to draw a crowd, Johann falsified his son's age. He shaved years off the boy, printed him as younger than he really was, to make the little pianist seem more of a marvel than he already was. Think about that for a moment, gently, without anger. Because it is late, and anger has no place here. A father so anxious to sell the wonder of his child that he lied about how many years the child had lived. The boy sat at the keyboard, and above him on the wall was a number that was not true, a smaller number, meant to make strangers gasp a little louder. It is a tiny thing, a printer's line, but it tells you almost everything about the pressure that pressed on him from the start. The boy's ordinary schooling, meanwhile, the kind of general education another child might get, was thin and got thinner. He left regular school quite young, around the age of 11, and much of what most children learn simply passed him by. All his life he remained shaky with things like multiplication and spelling, the everyday arithmetic, and letters that come so easily to people whose minds run along ordinary tracks. His genius was not wide. It was narrow and deep, a single shaft driven straight down into music, with the rest of the landscape left largely untended. He could do things with sound that no one else alive could do, and he could not reliably multiply two numbers together. There is a kind of comfort in that, if you let there be. Even the greatest minds are lopsided. They pour everything down one channel and leave the others dry. The boy who could not spell would one day imagine a symphony he could not hear. And then, into this house of a drinking father and a lied-about age and a thin, abandoned schooling, there came a teacher. And the right teacher, arriving at the right time in a young life, can change the whole direction of it. His name was Christian Gottlob Niefe. Niefe was the court organist in Bonn, the man responsible for playing the great organ in services and ceremonies, a serious and educated musician, and he took the boy under his wing. This was the first true stroke of luck in a life that had not had much. Because Neef did not simply teach the child scales and technique, the ordinary drills. He handed him a door into the deepest music that existed. He gave him Bach. Specifically, he set the boy to work on a collection called The Well-Tempered Clavier by Johann Sebastian Bach, the old master of the previous generation. Now let me tell you gently what that collection is. Because it matters. The Well-Tempered Clavier is a set of pieces Bach wrote that moves patiently through every possible key, every one of the different musical homes a piece of music can live in. Imagine a builder who, to show what could be done, constructs a small perfect house in every single style and on every single kind of ground, one after another, leaving nothing out. That is what Bach did with sound. He wrote a piece in each key, again and again, a great methodical journey through the entire territory of music, and each piece is at once a demonstration and a small living work of art. For a young keyboard player, working through the Well-Tempered Clavier was, and still is, a kind of education in itself. A way of learning not just how to move your fingers, but how music is built from the ground up, how voices weave over and under one another, how a small idea can be turned and answered and grown into a whole structure. So there was the boy, in Bonn, at the keyboard, working his way through Bach under the eye of Neefe, absorbing this vast, patient architecture of sound into a mind that could not spell but could hold music the way other minds hold nothing at all. And this is where you begin to see the shape of the man he would become. Because everything he was learning here, the structure, the inner logic of how notes fit together, the way music could be built like a building rather than merely felt like a mood, all of it was going into his memory, into that deep, narrow channel. He was learning the grammar of sound so thoroughly, so bone deep, that one day, when the sound itself was taken from him, the grammar would remain. He would still know, without hearing, how the house was built. He would still be able to imagine every room of it in the dark. And Neefe did more than teach. He trusted the boy with real work. While Beethoven was still very young, in his early teens, Neefe let him stand in as the court organist, substituting for his own teacher, actually playing the organ for the court when Neefe was away. Think of what that meant. A boy barely into his teens, sitting at the great instrument of the court, his hands on the keys, his feet on the pedals, filling a chapel with sound, doing the job of a grown professional musician. It was a mark of extraordinary trust and extraordinary ability. He was not merely a student anymore, a child paraded on a poster with a false age. He was, quietly, already a working musician, holding down a real post, making the music the court needed made. And so the true foundation was laid, not in the false glitter his father had wanted, the marketed marvel, the fake age, the dream of another Mozart, but in this quieter, realer thing. A serious teacher, the deepest music of the age, a collection that moved through every key like a lamp carried through every room of a house, a boy trusted to play for the court. The gift was real, and now, for the first time, it was being fed properly, being given something worthy of it to grow into. But you can already feel, can't you, the weight sitting over all of it. A gifted child in a house shadowed by a father's drinking. A name that carried both honour and pressure, the grandfather's greatness and the father's failure both pressing down at once. A boy whose whole self was pouring into the one narrow channel of music, because music was the one place the world made sense, the one place he was not lied about, but simply, undeniably good. And out beyond all of it, still years away, still unimaginable to that boy at the organ, was the thing that would come for him in his late 20s and take, of all the things it could have taken from a man, the very sense his entire life was built upon. His ears, the listening, the one road by which music reached him from the outside world. He did not know yet. How could he? He was just a boy in Bonn, on the Rhine, in the cold, working through Bach under a kind teacher's eye, filling the court chapel with organ sound, carrying home a little of his father's salary when he had to, learning the deep architecture of music so completely that it was becoming part of the very structure of his mind. He was building, without knowing he was building it, the inner house he would one day have to live in entirely. The house of remembered and imagined sound, the one place the silence could never quite reach. And that is where we will pause for tonight's first stretch of the journey, with the boy at the keyboard and the river outside, and the whole vast, difficult, luminous life still ahead of him. There is so much more to come. The great city of Vienna, and how he took it by storm, not with his written music at first, but with his hands, improvising until grown men and women wept. The first small strange signs of trouble, a ringing that would not stop, high notes that began to fade, a letter written in a quiet village that no one was ever meant to read, and the slow, patient, astonishing way a man learnt to make music out of a world going silent around him. But for now, let the boy stay at the organ. Let the winter hold still over Bonn. Let your breathing go slower and deeper, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the tide goes out and comes in without any effort at all. So let him stay. But keep, if you will, one picture in the back of your mind as you sink lower into the pillow, because it is the picture this whole slow journey will be walking toward. It is Vienna. The 7th of May in the year 1824. A crowded hall. On the stage stands a man of 53, heavier now, his grey hair wild, a sheaf of music before him, beating time with his arms to an orchestra and a great chorus of voices. He is not the one truly leading them. Off to the side, a younger conductor named Michael Umlauf holds the players together, having quietly told them beforehand to watch his hand and not the older man's, to follow him and let the master keep his own private time. And so two tempos live in that room at once, the one the musicians play and the one the deaf man beats. The music ends. The last enormous chord of the Ninth Symphony rolls out over the audience and dissolves into the air, and the hall erupts. People are on their feet, they are shouting, weeping, lifting their hands, and the man at the centre of it goes on beating time to a piece that has already finished, his back turned to all of it, hearing none of it, still inside the version of the sound that plays only in his head. He does not turn. He cannot know. Until one of the singers, the young contralto Caroline Unger, steps up beside him and with a gentle hand takes him by the sleeve and turns his whole body around so that his eyes can see what his ears will never give him. The rising rows of people, the open mouths, the ovation he is standing inside of and cannot hear. Hold that. The turned body, the seen applause. We will come back to it at the very end, when you may already be asleep. Because here is the question this whole night is built around, the one I would like you to carry down with you into the dark. How does a man write music he cannot hear? Not a small tune. The largest, strangest, most towering music of his life, composed in a silence so complete that at its triumph he had to be turned by the shoulder to know it had come. And underneath that, a quieter question. Why? Why did the hearing go at all? We still do not fully know, and I promise you we will sit with that not knowing gently, the way you sit with fog on the water, not frightened by it, only held. If you are already drifting, let yourself drift. There is no test at the end of this. But if you are still here, with me, awake in the low light, I would quietly love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Leave it below, a city, a country, a single dark room. And if you are new to this harbour, and the slow telling suits you, you are welcome to stay as long as you like. Tonight we go all the way down into one life, one long descent, and you may fall asleep anywhere along the way. For now, before we return to the beginning, let me answer a little of the how, because the how is stranger and more tender than the legend usually allows. When the sound had almost gone, this man had the legs of his pianos sawed down, cut short, so the great wooden body of the instrument sat low, close against the floorboards. And he would lean into it, he would press his ear, and later his whole self, against the wood. Later still, when even that was not enough, he took a slender wooden rod, and he clenched one end of it between his teeth, and he set the other end against the soundboard of the piano, and he played. The trembling of the strings travelled up the rod, through his jaw, into the bones of his skull, and there, deep inside the hard architecture of his own head, the music arrived. Not through the ruined ears, through bone, through the body itself becoming the instrument of listening. But he did not begin like that, a grey man biting a rod in a silent room. He began small and cold and ordinary. He was baptized in the city of Bonn on the 17th of December in the year 1770. We do not even know for certain the day he was born, only the day the water touched him in the church, which tells you something of how little the world expected of the infant. His name carried a small, foreign flourish. The van in Beethoven is Flemish, a low country word, plain, meaning only from a place. Years later, in Vienna, he would let people mistake it for the German von, the little word of nobleman, and he would not always hurry to correct them. His grandfather, another Ludwig, had been a Kapellmeister, a respected master of the court music in Bonn, a solid and dignified man the boy could look up to, and did. His father, Johann, was a smaller figure, a court tenor of thin talent and thick thirst, a man who drank, and who looked at his quiet, gifted son, and saw not a child, but a chance. Johann had watched the world lose its head over a boy from Salzburg named Mozart, and he wanted a Mozart of his own. So when he set little Ludwig before an audience, he lied. On the concert poster he shaved years off the boy's true age, made him younger than he was, so the playing would seem more impossible, so the crowd would gasp a little louder at so small a pair of hands doing so much. And the boy sat down at the keyboard in a borrowed light and did what he was told, not yet knowing what any of it was for. The teacher who finally reached him was not his father. A man named Christian Gottlob Niefe arrived at the Bonn court as organist and looked at this boy and understood something Johann never had, which was that the child's gift was not a commodity to be sold, but a thing that needed to be fed. Niefe gave him Bach. Not scales and exercises, not the decorative trifles that filled aristocratic drawing rooms, but the well-tempered clavier. Johann Sebastian Bach's great systematic voyage through all the keys, 48 preludes and fugues of extraordinary density and logic, written half a century before the boy was born, and still not fully absorbed by the world. Ludwig sat with them, he went deep into them. And something in how that music was built, the way one voice answered another, The way a single theme could be inverted and augmented and returned to its own source transformed began to take root in him in a way that would shape everything he ever wrote. Neef trusted the boy enough to leave him in charge of the court organ when he travelled, so that this not yet teenager was playing the church service, sitting where his grandfather had sat, the music passing through his hands and into the vaulted room above the congregation. It was the closest to stability the boy would know for some years. In 1787, when Ludwig was 16, a plan was made to send him to Vienna. Vienna was the centre of the musical world, and in Vienna was a man named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and the idea, tentative, expensive, full of hope, was that the boy might study with him. Whether he ever actually played for Mozart, whether the great man heard him at all, is not something the historical record can confirm with certainty. A story has been passed down in which Mozart, having heard the young Beethoven improvise, turned to someone nearby and said words to the effect of "Watch this one. He will make a noise in the world." But that story comes through channels too distant and too convenient to be trusted as fact. It belongs to legend, not to what we can honestly say happened. What we do know is that the trip was cut short almost as soon as it began. He had to go home. His mother, Maria Magdalena van Beethoven, was ill. Tuberculosis had taken hold of her, that slow dissolving sickness, and she died in July of 1787, a few months after he returned to Bonn. He was 16 years old when she became sick, 17 when she died. In a letter written years later to his childhood friend Franz Gerhard Wegeler, he would call her his best friend. There is a plainness to that phrase, a young man's plainness, that resists embellishment. Best friend. Not mother in the formal distant sense, but the person he talked to, the person in the house who saw him. After she was gone, Johann van Beethoven did not hold himself together. The drinking, which had always been there, moved to the centre. He lost positions, missed duties, was in some accounts found incapable at moments that required him to be capable. The family had 2 younger boys besides Ludwig, his brothers Karl and Johann, and someone had to maintain the household. Ludwig was 17. He petitioned the electoral court to have a portion of his father's salary paid directly to him, so that the money would not disappear before it could feed anyone. The court agreed. A boy of 17, managing the wreckage of a drunk father's neglected life, keeping his brothers clothed and the household from collapsing entirely. He had grown up fast in the years of performance and Niefe and Bach, but this was a different kind of growing up. This was learning that the world does not wait for you to be ready. He stayed in Bonn for 5 more years. He played, he composed, he waited. He worked at the court, he moved in the circles of educated and aristocratic Bonn society that would teach him how such people thought and spoke, and what they expected of the musicians around them. And he waited, with the patience of someone who knows something is coming but cannot yet say exactly when. It came in November of 1792. He was 21 years old, and the Bonn court funded his departure for Vienna, a proper relocation this time, not a visit. Among the entries made in his farewell album by friends and patrons who wished him well, the most remarkable was written by a man named Ferdinand von Waldstein, a count who had been a supporter of the young musician and who understood, perhaps better than most, what the boy was going to become. Waldstein wrote that through uninterrupted diligence, Ludwig would receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. It is the kind of sentence that sounds like it was written to be quoted, and indeed it has been, for more than 2 centuries. But what it meant in the moment was something more particular. Mozart was dead. He had died the previous year, in December of 1791, at 35, and the world still had not quite absorbed that loss, and Haydn, Joseph Haydn, the great old master, was alive in Vienna, and the plan was that this restless young man from Bonn would study with him. The spirit passed on. The flame carried forward. The relationship with Haydn was not what the image suggests. Haydn was 60 years old when the 21-year-old Beethoven arrived, famous throughout Europe. Generous in general, kind in disposition, but occupied. He had his own work, his own concerns, his own vast and settled reputation. He gave Beethoven lessons, and he corrected his counterpoint, the technical study of how musical voices move and relate to each other. But Beethoven began to feel that the corrections were not always being properly made, that errors were passing through unchecked, that the great man was not attending with the thoroughness the student required. He may have been right. He may have been impatient. Both things can be true at once. He began, quietly, to take extra lessons from another musician in Vienna, a man named Johann Schenk, without telling Haydn. He continued to attend Haydn's lessons with a copybook of exercises that were not the ones he had actually written, so that Haydn would see only the corrected versions and not know that a second teacher had done the correcting. It was a small deception, the kind a driven and slightly proud young man might pull off without quite understanding that it also said something about him. He needed more than he was getting. He went and got it. That too would become a pattern. But Vienna was not yet ready for his compositions. Vienna was ready for something else. He conquered the city first, not as a composer, but as a pianist, and specifically as an improviser, and that distinction matters more than it might seem. Any trained musician could play the notes as written. What Beethoven did at the keyboard when he improvised was different in kind, not just in degree. Contemporaries left accounts that circle around the same stunned vocabulary. Tears, astonishment, something that felt less like attending a performance and more like being reached. He would sit down and begin, and what came out was not arranged or rehearsed, but invented in the moment, and it went somewhere audiences did not expect, through keys and moods and intensities that seemed to follow their own internal necessity. And when it was over, people found that they had been moved without knowing exactly how. One of the things Haydn is reported to have said, perhaps with some ambivalence, is that Beethoven was unlike anyone he had ever encountered at the instrument. There were rivalries, of course. Vienna had other virtuosos, other young men with fast fingers and confident reputations. And the way a pianist established himself in those circles was partly through direct competition. The keyboard duel, which was exactly what it sounds like. Two players, an audience, a test of who could outwit and outplay the other, trading passages, matching difficulty, until one of them ran out of answers. A pianist named Daniel Steibelt arrived in Vienna with a considerable European reputation, sharp-dressed and assured, and was drawn into one of these contests with Beethoven. The accounts say that Beethoven, who could be theatrical when the situation called for it, picked up a page from Steibelt's own music that was lying on a stand nearby, placed it on the keyboard upside down, played a few notes from it as a mocking theme, and then proceeded to improvise from that inverted scrap with such extravagant invention and force that Steibelt left the room before it was over, left Vienna shortly after, and by some accounts refused for years to return to any city where he might encounter Beethoven. Whether every detail of that story is exact, it captures something true about the energy of these confrontations, about what Beethoven brought to them, a ferocity and a wit that made losing to him not just a defeat, but a humiliation, a thing you remembered. He was not easy, this young man. He was not grateful in the ways that patrons expected gratitude. He was not polished, not soothing, not the kind of musician who said the right things at dinners and adjusted his conversation to flatter the person who was paying for his dinner. He said what he thought, sometimes at a volume and directness that made people in fine drawing rooms very uncomfortable. He was unkempt. His hair, famously, resisted any arrangement. His clothing was sometimes not quite what the occasion demanded. He would move without warning into a cloud of abstraction in the middle of a conversation and come back from it without explanation. He poured a plate of food over a waiter's head on an occasion the details of which history has not entirely preserved, and one imagines the waiter and the room, and the specific quality of the silence that followed. He moved lodgings at a frequency that became a kind of ongoing Viennese joke. Estimates of how many different addresses he occupied over his 35 years in the city run to 60 or 70, sometimes moving because of a dispute with a landlord, sometimes because a whim struck him, sometimes seemingly for reasons no one could work out at all. He would pack his manuscripts and his battered instruments and his conversation and his chaos and remove himself to somewhere new, and then begin again. And yet the aristocracy of Vienna did not let him go. They could not quite let him go, because what he gave them in exchange for the difficulty was something they could not purchase from anyone else. Prince Karl Lichnowsky was among the first to take him informally, to provide him with lodgings and a stipend and the kind of protection that allowed a young musician to compose without immediately starving. He did not always honour the arrangement with grace, and eventually left. Prince Franz Joseph von Lobkowitz became a supporter, and Count Andreas Razumovsky, the Russian ambassador, commissioned the 3-string quartets that carry his name, the Razumovsky Quartets, works of a scope and seriousness that announced what Beethoven was becoming. And Archduke Rudolf of Austria, the youngest brother of the emperor, became a student and, eventually, a friend, as much as Beethoven permitted friendship, and a patron of unusual loyalty and genuine musical understanding. By 1809, the arrangement had become something almost without precedent. 3 of his patrons, Archduke Rudolf, Prince Kinsky, and Prince Lobkowitz, came together and jointly guaranteed him an annual income, a fixed sum, simply to keep him in Vienna and composing, not in exchange for specific works, not in exchange for teaching their children or playing at their parties. Simply to exist in Vienna and to write what he would write. It was, for a composer who held no court position, who answered to no employer in the conventional sense, a remarkable thing. They knew what they had. They were willing to pay simply to be in the same city as the source of it. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. Through all of this, he was composing. The early piano sonatas, the first 2 symphonies, the early quartets, the concertos for piano. The work poured out of a man who was also arguing with landlords and losing his hat and writing passionate letters to women who were in various ways not available to him, and managing his brothers from a distance, and fighting with publishers over fees, and conducting with a physical expressiveness that reportedly involved him crouching down almost to the floor during soft passages and leaping up onto his toes for the loud ones, a sight that startled players and enchanted audiences and occasionally knocked over music stands. He was large in every direction, his appetites, his angers, his generosities, his stubbornness, his grief, his capacity for work. Vienna contained him, barely, and the music that came out of all that friction and feeling was only getting larger. And then, around 1798, something began to happen that had nothing to do with his father, or his lodgings, or his rivals, or his patrons, or any of the reversible difficulties of a life lived loudly. It started as a sound, not silence. That is the thing people do not expect when they first hear the story. The thing that does not fit the image of sudden blankness falling over a listening man. It started as a sound that would not stop. A ringing, a buzzing, a persistent noise in the inner ear that was always there, underneath everything, day and night, a note no instrument was playing. Tinnitus, the word is, from the Latin for ringing, and anyone who has experienced even a mild version of it knows how it sits in the skull, how it is always there when the room goes quiet, how it begins to colour even the moments that were previously clean and private. For a musician, for this musician, the ringing was not nothing. It began around 1798 and progressed. What he lost in the early years was not all frequency at once, but the high end first, the delicate upper registers where a flute sings or a shepherd's pipe carries across a field in the morning. He could hear the low notes still. He could hear the middle range, for a while. But the high ones thinned and faded. And with them went some of his ability to understand speech, particularly when there was other noise nearby, other voices, the ambient sound of a room full of people talking. He began to struggle in company. He had to position himself differently at concerts to catch what the orchestra was doing. He stood closer to the players than a man in his position normally stood, leaning in, head tilted, trying to extract from the physical proximity some portion of what the air was no longer delivering to him cleanly. He hid it. For years he hid it. The hiding was not vanity, exactly, though vanity was not entirely absent. It was fear of a particular and specific kind, the fear that if the musicians he worked with, the audiences who came to hear him, the patrons who paid his annuity, the editors and publishers and critics who evaluated his standing in the world, if any of them knew that his hearing was failing, the whole architecture of what he had built would come apart. A composer was expected to hear. A pianist emphatically had to hear. The assumption was so fundamental that it had never needed to be stated. And so he avoided conversations in which he might have to ask someone to repeat themselves. He avoided situations that would expose the gap. He began to seem, to people who did not know him well, increasingly solitary and suspicious, a man who did not want company, who preferred to move through the world at a remove. He was not wrong to fear what disclosure might bring. But the cost of concealment was that the loneliness the deafness imposed was doubled by the loneliness of having to carry it in secret. There were two people he came closest to telling. One of them was Franz Gerhard Wegeler, his old friend from Bonn, the one who had known him since childhood, the one who had seen him before he was famous, who remembered the boy at the keyboard and the household fallen to pieces after Maria Magdalena died. Wegeler was a doctor. He was safe, in the way that old friends are sometimes safe, because they already know too much to be shocked by anything further. In 1801, Beethoven wrote to him, and what came out in that letter was the thing he had been keeping in. He told Wegeler that his hearing had been failing for 3 years, that the weakness was in both ears, that in musical company he had to stand very close to the orchestra to hear the players on the upper end, that from a distance he could not catch the high notes of a violin or a flute, that when someone spoke to him softly, he often could not make out the words at all, though he could hear that someone was speaking. And then he said the particular thing, the image that lodged itself in him and stayed, the image of the shepherd in the field. He wrote that he could not hear from a distance a shepherd's singing, a sound that others around him heard without difficulty, the sort of sound that is part of the background of the world, easy and unconsidered, the sound of someone on a hillside doing something ordinary, and he could not hear it. He was in the same field, and the sound did not reach him. There is something in that image that captures the specific texture of what early hearing loss feels like more precisely than any clinical description. Not the drama of sudden silence, not the sharp cut of something taken away at once, but the gradual discovery that the world has begun doing things nearby that no longer include you, that small sounds, background sounds, sounds no one thinks to mention because they are just there, have quietly withdrawn their offer. The shepherd was singing. Everyone else heard it. He did not. He told Wegeler that he had been going to doctors, trying remedies that did not work, lukewarm baths, herbal treatments, tonic pills, the standard offerings of an era when the mechanisms of the inner ear were not well understood. The ringing had not stopped. He told Wegeler that he tried not to think about it, and that sometimes he could not stop thinking about it. He asked for Wegeler's advice, in the tentative way of someone who already suspects there is no good advice to be given, but needs to ask another person nonetheless. And then, in that same letter, he said something that sounds like the beginning of a resolution rather than the end of one. He said he was not going to let it break him. He said the words in a different way, the way a man of his time and his particular stubbornness would say them, but the meaning was, not yet, not this, not without a fight. He did not yet know what form the fight would take. He did not yet know that the work still ahead of him would be what they would be. But the intention was already forming, underneath the fear, the way a melody sometimes exists in the mind before there are any notes on paper. The ringing continued, the high notes continued their slow withdrawal. And in Vienna, in lodgings that changed and changed again, at pianos that were beginning to wear out under his force, in manuscripts covered in crossings out and revisions and the evidence of a mind that never stopped working. The music continued too. That is what is so difficult to hold in the mind at once, that the sound was going, and the music was coming simultaneously in the same body, in the same room, in the same hands. The ringing that would not stop. The melody that would not stop either. He was 30 years old. He had been in Vienna for 9 years. He had a reputation that was already, in some circles, that of the finest composer living. He had patrons who would soon bind themselves contractually to keep him in the city. He had won the piano duels and moved the audiences and composed works that people were playing across Europe. And underneath all of it, in the private interior of the man, in the space between what the world saw and what he knew, there was a steady diminishment happening, a thing he was carrying alone, a thing that the letters and the concert halls and the difficult, bright, generous, furious surface of his public life were being used in part to conceal. The shepherd was still singing on a hillside somewhere. The world still carried that sound. He could not quite reach it anymore. And he had not yet written what he needed to write. Not even close. The works that would answer the question the world was already beginning to ask about him. How and from where, and at what cost, those works were still somewhere ahead, in the silence that was slowly, inexorably, becoming the only room he had left. Go back, then, to the summer of 1787. He was 16 years old and travelling for the first time, alone, all the way from Bonn to Vienna, a journey of considerable distance for a young musician who had never been farther than the edge of the Rhineland, carrying with him a small reputation and a large ambition and, somewhere in his chest, the uncertain hope that in the capital of European music he might find what Bonn could not quite give him. Whether he played for Mozart in those weeks is a thing the record does not clearly settle. The famous remark attributed to the older composer, "Watch this lad, he will make a noise in the world," comes down to us through sources that cannot be fully trusted, and honesty requires that we hold it as a pleasing tradition rather than a documented fact. But Vienna was real. The young Beethoven was there. And then the letter came from Bonn, and he had to go home. His mother, Maria Magdalena van Beethoven, was dying of tuberculosis. She died in July of that year. He was 16. She was 40 years old. And the Vienna he had briefly glimpsed, that first, bright, enormous glimpse of a world far larger than the one he had grown up in, closed behind him as he made the long journey back to the river and the court and the cramped life he had begun to outgrow. What came after was not easy. His father, Johann, a court tenor who had always drunk too much and accomplished too little, now drank more and accomplished nothing. The pension from the court continued, in part, because the young Beethoven petitioned for it directly, arranging for a portion of his father's salary to be paid to him instead, so that his brothers would have something to eat. He was 17 years old, and he was the functioning head of a household. The elder Beethoven's name remained on the document. The younger Beethoven bore the weight of what the name implied. He spent 5 more years in Bonn, playing at court, studying with Christian Gottlob Nefer, who had first shown him the well-tempered clavier and trusted him to substitute at the organ when he was barely in his teens, playing in the court orchestra, writing, sending a small number of compositions into the world and watching them return very little in the way of recognition. But the city was too small for what was accumulating inside him, and eventually a patron took notice. Count Ferdinand von Waldstein wrote in Beethoven's farewell album in November of 1792 a line that has survived everything the centuries could do to it: "You will receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn." It was an extravagant thing to write to a young man of 21. It was also, in the compressed way that farewell sentiments sometimes are, exactly correct. The Bonn court funded the move. Beethoven arrived in Vienna for the second time, and this time he did not go back. Joseph Haydn was 60 years old, vastly famous, and not, as it turned out, the most attentive of teachers. The lessons happened. The affection between the two men was genuine, if uneven. But Beethoven, who had precise and demanding ideas about what instruction should feel like, found Haydn's corrections insufficient, and so he did what people with sufficient pride and insufficient patience often do. He found another teacher and kept the arrangement quiet. Johann Schenk gave him lessons in secret, while the official relationship with Haydn continued to provide social credibility. Whether Haydn ever knew is not certain. The studying continued by whatever means available. But it was not as a student that Vienna came to know him. Not yet. He had arrived in a city that had an opinion about everything, and that opinion was formed quickly, and what it formed around, in those first years, was the sound he made at a keyboard. He was a pianist before he was a composer, in the sense that reputation arrived first through performance, and the performances were extraordinary, not because they were technically perfect, though they were technically remarkable, but because they were alive in a way that other performances were not quite. Contemporaries tried to describe what happened in those rooms and struggled, as people always struggle to describe music, but the word that appears repeatedly is tears. The audience wept, not from sadness, but from something harder to name, from recognition perhaps, or from the particular vertigo of hearing someone play as though the sound mattered to them personally, as though it had a cost. He won the piano duels. The most famous involved the German pianist Daniel Steibelt, who arrived in Vienna with a considerable reputation and an inclination to display it. Their encounter did not go the way Steibelt had anticipated. Beethoven took one of Steibelt's own pieces, turned it upside down on the piano, and improvised on it so definitively that Steibelt left Vienna and, according to those who kept careful track of such things, refused to return to any city where Beethoven resided. There is satisfaction in that story. There is also something quietly melancholy in it, if you know what comes after. The patrons gathered. Prince Karl Lichnowsky opened his house and his resources. Prince Franz Joseph von Lobkowitz, Count Andreas Razumovsky, and the young Archduke Rudolf of Austria all became supporters in the practical, material sense that a composer in those years needed to survive. In 1809, as war moved through Europe and Beethoven received an offer to leave Vienna for a position in Westphalia, three of these patrons, Rudolf, Prince Kinsky, and Lobkowitz, formalized their support into a joint annuity, a guaranteed annual income paid simply to keep him in the city. It was an almost unprecedented arrangement. It recognized, without quite saying so, that what Beethoven was doing in Vienna was not merely a career, but a kind of event that the city could not afford to lose. He was not easy to keep. He moved through the city restlessly, leaving one set of rooms for another, accumulating addresses the way other people accumulate furniture, 60 or more lodgings over the course of his life there. He was unkempt. He was proud in a way that read as rudeness to people who expected deference. He argued. He walked out. He composed in conditions that baffled his contemporaries, sheets of paper covered in a hand so turbulent it was nearly impossible to decipher, standing at a desk, pacing, pouring water over his head when the heat became too much, and letting it run through the floorboards onto whoever was unlucky enough to be living below. He was difficult and generous and furious and brilliant all at once, and Vienna both tolerated and adored him for it, in the complicated way that cities sometimes adore the people they cannot quite contain. And all of this, the duels and the patrons and the difficult, combustible, magnificent surface of the man, was beginning, by the late 1790s, to be built over a foundation that was quietly shifting. The first symptom was not silence. That is the thing most people do not realize, or do not pause long enough to imagine. Silence came later. What came first was noise, a ringing, a buzzing, a sound that was not music and was not the world and would not stop. Tinnitus, we would call it now. He had no clean word for it then, only the experience of it, which he described in letters with the kind of precision that comes from having listened very carefully to something you cannot make stop. The high notes began to go, the distant sounds. He stood close to the orchestra to try to catch what was fading at the upper register. And there was a shepherd somewhere on a hillside singing, and others could hear it, and he could not quite reach it any more. He hid it. For years he hid it, avoiding company and conversation, because conversation had become something he had to strain and lean toward rather than simply enter, and he did not want anyone to see him straining. The world read the withdrawal as misanthropy, as pride, as the natural eccentricity of genius. He let them read it that way. The alternative was a truth he was not ready to give anyone. In 1801, he wrote to his old friend Franz Gerhard Wegeler in Bonn. He had been carrying this alone for 3 years. The letter opened quietly, and then, gradually, did not. He confessed everything he had been concealing, the buzzing, the ringing, the standing close to the musicians to hear the treble, the shepherd's voice he could no longer reach across an open hillside. And underneath the words, something else, the knowledge that a musician who cannot hear is a musician the world does not know what to do with, and so the world must not know. He asked Wegeler to say nothing. He was 30 years old. But even as he asked Wegeler to say nothing, something else was already moving in him. It was in that same letter, written in late 1801, that he first put words to the thing that would carry him forward. Not hope, exactly, and not denial, but something harder and less comfortable than either. He wrote to Wegeler that he intended to seize fate by the throat. The phrase in German is blunt and physical and entirely characteristic of him. Ich will dem Schicksal in den Rachen greifen. I will seize fate by the throat. It shall not wholly overcome me. There is no elegance in the phrasing, no philosophical distance. It reads the way he played, as if the point were to subdue something, to impose his own will on a force that was moving against him. And yet it is also the sentence of a man who is frightened, because you do not say such things to a friend in a letter unless the fear is very close. He was frightened. That much is clear, and the fear had a specific texture to it, different from the ordinary fear of failure that every artist carries around in some quiet corner of themselves. This was the fear of a man who had built his entire identity around something that was being taken from him by a process he could not see or stop or understand. He was a musician. Not in the way a painter is a painter, or a writer is a writer, as a life's occupation, a profession, a vocation pursued at a desk in a room. He had grown up inside sound. His earliest memory of himself was probably musical. His grandfather had been a Kapellmeister. His father had been a tenor. The Bonn court had been a place where music was the air of daily life. And then Christian Gottlob Neff had sat him down in front of Bach's well-tempered clavier and shown him that sound was not merely something you made, but something you inhabited, something with architecture and law and meaning layered beneath meaning. And then Vienna had opened its arms to him precisely because of what his ears could do, not only his hands, not only his knowledge of harmony and counterpoint, but the specific, uncanny, irreplaceable thing his ears could do when he sat down at a piano and began to improvise. He had wept audiences with sounds he invented in the moment. That was his power. That was the root of everything he had built. And now the root was quietly, stubbornly, inexplicably dying. He did not know why. He had no way of knowing why, and neither truly do we, which is something worth pausing on, because there is a great deal of confident explanation surrounding Beethoven's deafness, and most of it is more confident than the evidence warrants. The doctors of his own time proposed various causes and could help him with none of them. The doctors and scholars of subsequent centuries have proposed otosclerosis, which is an abnormal growth of bone in the middle ear that locks the tiny mechanical chain responsible for conveying sound. They have proposed Paget's disease, a disorder of bone remodeling. They have proposed systemic lupus, an autoimmune condition that can damage tissue throughout the body. They have proposed typhus, which he is documented to have suffered at some point. They have proposed syphilis. They have, perhaps most persistently and dramatically, proposed lead poisoning, and for a long time the lead poisoning theory seemed to have something close to physical evidence behind it, because strands of hair long attributed to Beethoven were found to carry unusually high concentrations of lead, consistent with someone who had been chronically exposed to the metal. Perhaps through the mineral waters he drank at spas, or through the pewter wine vessels he used, or through the treatments his doctors administered, some of which we now know contained lead compounds. The lead story was elegant, and it was grim, and it circulated very widely. And then, in 2023, a genomic study published in the journal Current Biology arrived and quietly complicated it. Researchers had managed to extract and sequence DNA from authenticated locks of Beethoven's hair, authenticated, that is, from a documented chain of provenance that made them genuinely likely to be his. And what they found was important in what it revealed, and equally important in what it did not. The genome showed a clear genetic predisposition to liver disease. It showed evidence of a hepatitis B infection in the months before his death, a finding consistent with the severe abdominal illness that would eventually kill him. These were real findings, grounded in the actual biology of the man. But here is the part that tends to get lost. The same study, using the same authenticated hair, could not identify a genetic cause for the deafness. The genome was silent on that question, or at least offered nothing decisive. And the study also found that one of the most famous locks of hair long associated with Beethoven, the so-called Hiller lock, which had been among the primary specimens used to advance the lead poisoning theory, was not his at all. The DNA indicated it had come from a woman. The evidence that had seemed to anchor one of the most persistent explanations for his deafness turned out not to be evidence from Beethoven at all. So we are left where he was left. We do not know why he went deaf. We have possibilities, and we have theories, and we have a long list of things he suffered that might have contributed, and we do not have an answer. And there is something quietly appropriate about that. Because he lived his entire adult life inside that same not knowing, the ringing and the buzzing and the slow withdrawal of the upper frequencies and eventually of nearly everything. And no physician, no spa, no ear trumpet, no remedy, no period of rest prescribed by well, meaning doctors could tell him why his body was doing this, or when it would stop, or how far it would go. He simply had to live inside the uncertainty and decide what to do with it. What the doctors could offer him in the autumn of 1802 was rest, quiet, a change of air, away from Vienna, away from the social obligations and the performances and the concerts he was increasingly unable to navigate. His physician sent him to Heiligenstadt, a village just outside the city. A small, quiet place, the kind of settlement that in the early 19th century was genuinely rural, genuinely removed, with fields and trees and a pace of life that bore no resemblance to the drawing rooms and concert halls and coffee houses of Vienna. He went. He spent the summer and the early autumn there, as the doctor had advised, resting his ears and his nerves in the relative stillness of the countryside. It did not help. Quick reminder. After years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. He spent the months in Heiligenstadt in what must have been a particular kind of misery, because the quiet the doctors prescribed was also the quiet that reminded him most acutely of what he was losing. In Vienna there was enough noise, enough busyness, enough social friction to fill in the gaps, to distract him from the withdrawal of sound. Out here, in a small village with open fields and birds and the ordinary sounds of country life, the comparison was inescapable. What other people could hear, he increasingly could not. The gap was not abstract. It was right there, in every moment, in the space between what the world contained and what reached him. And on the 6th of October, 1802, he sat down and wrote. The document he produced that day is addressed to his brothers Karl and Johann. It is dated. It runs to several pages. It has a formal quality in places, and then breaks open into something rawer and less composed, and it shifts register in ways that suggest a man writing without stopping to decide how much of himself to show, which perhaps explains why he never sent it. He wrote it to his brothers, and he did not send it, and he kept it among his papers, where it was found after his death, a quarter of a century later. It has been called the Heiligenstadt Testament, and it is one of the most studied personal documents in the whole history of music, which gives you a sense of how completely it breaks open something that the public figure of Beethoven, the difficult, proud, scowling, magnificent composer, kept sealed. He wrote about the humiliation. That is where the document begins, really, not with philosophy or self-pity, but with the specific, grinding humiliation of a musician who has to ask people to speak louder, who stands close to performers to hear what others can hear from a distance, who cannot understand what is being said to him in company and must pretend he has understood, must nod and agree and respond to some approximation of the conversation rather than the conversation itself. He wrote about standing beside the orchestra, trying to reach the high notes that were fading out of his range. He wrote about not being able to hear a shepherd singing on a hillside when everyone around him could. He wrote about what that did to a man who had built his life on the premise that he could hear everything. And then he wrote the thing that the document is most remembered for. He wrote that he had thought of ending his life, not in abstract terms, not with philosophical hedging, but plainly he had contemplated it and been brought very close to it. The word he used in the German points toward the same conclusion that a reading of the whole passage arrives at, that a man standing in a field, unable to hear a shepherd's song that he once would have heard across half a mile, had found himself at the edge of something he did not then cross. He had not crossed it, and he explained why. He wrote that it was the art that held him back. The conviction, not a comfortable belief, but something closer to a compulsion, that he had not yet done what he was on earth to do, that there were works inside him still waiting to be produced, and that he could not leave the world before he had produced them. He described it almost as a debt or an obligation, something he owed not to himself or to anyone else, but to the art itself and to whatever it was inside him that kept generating it. He added a short addendum 4 days later, dated the 10th of October. Then he folded the pages and kept them. He did not send them to Karl. He did not send them to Johann. He carried them with him for 25 years. The silence he brought back from Heiligenstadt was different from the silence he had arrived with. The rest had not restored his hearing. Nothing about the physical condition had changed. But something in him had changed, something that is easier to observe in what came after than to describe in the abstract. He returned to Vienna, and he resumed working, and the work that followed was not the work of a man who had accepted defeat. The Heiligenstadt period sits like a hinge in the middle of his life, the point at which a brilliant and celebrated virtuoso became something harder to name, a composer who had looked into the worst of what was coming and had decided to go toward it rather than away from it. Not with ease, not with serenity. With a kind of ferocious, sustained, almost belligerent creative energy that produced in the years immediately following some of the most expansive and powerful music he ever wrote. He had written to Wegeler in November of 1801, even before the Heiligenstadt months, that he would seize fate by the throat. And then, as if to demonstrate that this had not been an empty phrase, he went home from the countryside and began the Third Symphony. The Symphony No. 3 in E-flat major, which he called the Eroica, and which bears the opus number 55, was finished in 1804. It was, at the time, unlike anything that had previously existed in the form. It was longer than any symphony that had come before it, nearly twice the length of what the era considered a substantial orchestral work. Its first movement alone was an architectural event, a sustained argument in sound that built and complicated and turned back on itself and drove forward again with a momentum that audiences of the time found, depending on their disposition, either revelatory or exhausting. It was not the elegant, balanced, luminous craft of Haydn, whom he had studied and whom he admired even as he quietly bypassed him. It was not the crystalline invention of Mozart, whose spirit Count von Waldstein had told him to receive from Haydn's hands. It was something he had arrived at himself through years of study and practice and improvisation and the accumulated intelligence of a man who had listened to music more carefully than almost anyone alive, and who was now, increasingly, listening to it only from inside. The Fifth Symphony followed, in 1808, the Symphony No. 5 in C minor, Op. 67. Its opening is among the most recognized moments in all of Western music. 4 notes, short, 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 long, the same rhythmic shape stated and then restated a third lower, and then built upon and expanded until the whole first movement is essentially one long unfolding of those 4 notes and what they imply. There is a story, widely repeated, that Beethoven himself said those 4 notes represented fate knocking at the door. The story comes from his secretary, Anton Schindler, who was present for parts of his later life and wrote a biography that shaped how Beethoven was understood by subsequent generations. But Schindler is a complicated source, and this is a good moment to introduce that complication, because it matters for how we read much of what we think we know. Schindler's access to Beethoven was real, his devotion was genuine, and he was also, as was discovered through careful scholarly work in the 20th century, a forger. After Beethoven's death, Schindler took possession of the conversation books, the notebooks in which visitors wrote their side of conversations, and he destroyed a significant number of them, and in others he fabricated entries, inventing exchanges that never took place, and attributing to Beethoven words and attitudes and explanations that Schindler himself had composed, in order to shape the image of a man who could no longer object. The fate knocking at the door story is one of those attributions. It is part of the Schindler tradition, and it is best treated as tradition rather than fact. A good story, a compelling image, one that has served the Fifth Symphony's reputation for 2 centuries, but not something Beethoven demonstrably said. The music does what it does without the legend. It does not need Schindler's embellishment. What it needs, and what it has, is the thing Beethoven actually said, not about the Fifth, but about his situation, his condition, his refusal. I will seize fate by the throat. That is the documented phrase. That is the one that survives in his own handwriting in a letter to a friend he trusted. The music of these years is what that sentence sounds like when translated into sound. And the sound was being made, increasingly, by a man who was going further deaf. The mechanism by which he kept working is worth understanding slowly, because it is not mystical and it is not a paradox, though it can seem like both until you look at what is actually happening. Every trained musician has, to varying degrees, the capacity for what is sometimes called inner hearing or audiation, the ability to imagine the sound of a musical idea without that sound being physically produced. When a composer writes a melody on a page, they are not transcribing something they are hearing with their ears. They are hearing it in the mind, in the imagination, in some interior space where sound exists as a mental event rather than a physical one. For most composers, this inner hearing is a supplement to physical hearing, a useful faculty that operates alongside the actual acoustic experience of playing and listening and rehearsing with musicians. For Beethoven, as the outer hearing withdrew, the inner hearing had to become everything. It had to carry the entire load. He had the capacity for it. He had been building it for his entire life. A boy who had worked through Bach's well-tempered clavier under Niefer's guidance, who had been improvising complex structures at the keyboard since his early teens, who had spent years listening to orchestras and chamber groups and solo performers with the kind of close, analytical attention that most people do not even know how to bring to music. That man had a very detailed, very accurate, very richly stocked interior library of sound. He knew what a horn sounded like in the middle register and at the extremes of its range. He knew what a string section sounded like, playing pianissimo in the upper positions. He knew the acoustic difference between a chord played close to the bridge and one played near the fingerboard. He had heard all of these things thousands of times, in dozens of contexts, and somewhere inside him a representation of each one persisted, usable, referable, alive. When the outer sound faded, that library remained. He could compose from it. It was not easy, and it was not pleasant, and it was not the same as composing with full hearing, but it was possible. And he did it. The sketchbooks are the physical record of how it worked. Beethoven sketched obsessively, not the clean notation of a man writing down finished thoughts, but pages and pages of ideas in various stages, melodic fragments worked and reworked. A phrase tried in one key and then another, a rhythmic figure developed and then set aside, and then returned to weeks or months later. Sometimes years later. He was not a composer who wrote in a single inspired rush of inspiration, though there are moments in the sketchbooks where something arrives quickly and nearly complete. More characteristically, the sketchbooks show a mind that pursues an idea with enormous patience and stubbornness, a mind willing to work on a single passage across multiple sittings, across multiple months, unwilling to settle for the version that comes first or second or fifth. The Ode to Joy melody, which we will come to in its proper place, appears in various early forms in the sketchbooks long before the Ninth Symphony was assembled around it. He had been carrying it, in some form, for a very long time. The physical instruments he used tell part of the story too. At his piano, and he wore out many pianos, left strings broken, left instruments structurally damaged by the force with which he played them. He developed methods of compensating for what his ears could no longer do. He had the legs sawed down or removed entirely, so the instrument sat closer to the floor and the vibrations of the soundboard could travel more directly through the surfaces he was in contact with. He would place his ear against the wood of the piano, when he could still hear something through the physical contact that the air no longer reliably delivered. And later, as even that became insufficient, he used a rod, a wooden rod, or sometimes described as something like a pencil, which he clenched between his teeth and pressed against the soundboard of the instrument, so that the vibrations travelled through the jaw, through the bones of the skull, to whatever remained of the auditory processing inside him. This is bone conduction, the principle by which sound can bypass the damaged outer and middle ear and reach the inner ear through the skeleton itself. He had arrived at it not through any scientific knowledge of the mechanism. The term and the understanding came later, but through practical necessity, through the experience of a man who needed to feel the music when he could no longer hear it in the ordinary way. Johann Nepomuk Milzel, the Viennese inventor best known to history as the man who popularized the metronome, though the metronome had earlier forms before him, made a series of ear trumpets for Beethoven, devices designed to concentrate and amplify whatever sound remained accessible to him. Several of these instruments survive. They are held today at the Beethoven House in Bonn, the house in the Bongasse where he was born, and which has become a museum to his life and work. The ear trumpets are objects of a particular kind of pathos, large, slightly ungainly, funnel-shaped instruments made for a man who had once needed no amplification at all, who had been the amplifier, who had filled concert halls with sound by sitting down at a piano and letting his hands do what they had been trained from childhood to do. To see them is to understand something about the practicality of his situation that no amount of biographical description entirely conveys. He did not transcend the deafness. He built workarounds. He used what tools were available, however inadequate they were, and kept working. The pianos themselves bear witness. He was famously, almost violently, demanding on instruments. He played with a physical force that broke strings and damaged the mechanisms repeatedly. And the manufacturers who supplied him did so knowing that the pianos would not survive him intact. There is something in that detail, too, that speaks to the situation. A man who could no longer fully hear what he was playing pressing harder, as if volume might restore what clarity had lost. It did not restore it. But the music kept coming. The decade after Heiligenstadt produced the third and the fifth, as we have said, and also the fourth, the sixth, the seventh, and the eighth symphonies, and the violin concerto, and the fourth and fifth piano concertos, and the Razumovsky string quartets, and the Appassionata sonata, and much more. It was among the most extraordinarily productive periods in the history of Western music, which is a claim that sounds like hyperbole, but which the catalogue of those years simply supports when you look at it directly. The man who had sat in a village outside Vienna in the autumn of 1802 and written to his brothers that he had considered dying, that man went home and produced an archive of work that the world has been listening to for more than 2 centuries. His patrons sustained him through it. Prince Karl Lichnowsky, Prince Franz Joseph von Lobkowitz, Count Andreas Razumovsky, and above all Archduke Rudolph of Austria, these men understood, in varying degrees, that they were in the presence of something singular, and that their role was to make the conditions of that singularity as sustainable as possible. The arrangement formalized in 1809, when 3 of his patrons, Archduke Rudolph, Prince Kinsky, and Prince Lobkowitz, jointly guaranteed him an annual stipend simply to keep him in Vienna, was almost without precedent for a composer who was not formally employed by any of them. He was not writing music for their courts in exchange for a salary. He was being paid to exist, to stay in the city, to continue doing what he was doing. It was, in its way, an acknowledgement that what was happening in his rooms, at his worn-out pianos, in his chaotic, perpetually moving lodgings existence across the 60 or so addresses he occupied over his years in Vienna, all of that was worth more than the market for concert performances or published editions could reliably pay for on its own. He was not an easy man to sustain. He was not an easy man by any measure. He moved those 60 addresses across 35 years in Vienna, frequently in dispute with landlords, frequently leaving without warning or in acrimony, frequently occupying multiple lodgings simultaneously in a way that seemed to serve some organizational logic visible only to himself. He was unkempt in a way that contemporaries remarked upon consistently and colourfully. He once upended a plate of food over a waiter's head. He was capable of enormous warmth and capable of enormous cruelty, sometimes toward the same person within the same period of his life. He fell in love repeatedly and dramatically and invariably with women who were unavailable to him in one sense or another. Usually because they were aristocratic, often because they were already married or engaged or otherwise out of reach, always because he could not manage the sustained, ordinary, daily proximity that a lasting attachment requires. He never married. He lived alone in rooms that were, by all accounts, in a state of disorder that bordered on the theatrical. And through all of it, the moving, the disputes, the loneliness, the love affairs that never resolved into anything permanent, he composed. He composed through the progressive withdrawal of the sense that had been the foundation of everything he had done. He composed using the interior architecture he had built over a lifetime of listening, and the sketchbooks in which that architecture was tested and revised and refined, and the sawed-down pianos and the wooden rod and the Milsel ear trumpets that amplified what little the outer world still sent him. He composed increasingly in the silence inside, and in that silence something was changing in the music itself. His contemporaries noticed it, not always with comprehension. The late works, and by late we mean the works of roughly his last decade, from around 1815 to his death in 1827, have a quality that is difficult to account for entirely in terms of technique or even in terms of emotional maturity. They are strange in a specific way. The final piano sonatas push the instrument into registers and textures that seem designed for a sound the composer cannot hear, but can imagine more freely than one constrained by what the piano literally produces. The Missa Solemnis, the great choral work completed in 1823, has a scale and an ambition that borders on the unperformable, as if written not for the forces available, but for some ideal version of those forces existing in an interior space. And the late string quartets, 5 works, composed between 1824 and 1826, finishing in the last full year of his life, are among the most discussed and most mysterious pieces of music ever written, not because they are opaque or obscure in the way of puzzles, but because they seem to inhabit a register of expression that feels, to listeners across nearly 2 centuries, as if it is reaching somewhere that music had not previously been. He was deaf when he wrote them, almost completely deaf. The outer world of sound had largely withdrawn, and what remained was the library he carried inside him, and the pen that translated it onto the page. And what he translated in those final years was this: the late quartets, the Missa, and before all of them, the Ninth Symphony. Symphony No. 9 in D minor, Op. 125. He had been thinking about Friedrich Schiller's poem, the one called An die Freude, Ode to Joy, since his bonne youth, since sometime in the early 1790s, since before he had left for Vienna and won his piano duels and acquired his patrons and begun to go deaf. The poem had been in him for 30 years, waiting for the form it needed. And the form he found for it. A symphony that would do something no major symphony had done before, which was to bring human voices into the finale. A chorus and 4 soloists singing words. Took 30 years to arrive at. The melody he wrote for it is deliberately, almost disarmingly simple. It moves by step, mostly up one note, up one note, up one note, then down, then resolving. The kind of melody that a child can follow on first hearing, the kind that wants to be sung, that feels as though it was always somewhere waiting to be found rather than invented. It was not invented easily. The sketchbooks show it in various earlier forms, approached and set aside and approached again. But what he arrived at, in the end, was a melody that sounds inevitable. And that is a particular achievement for a man who composed it in near total deafness, to write the most immediately graspable, the most communal, the most humanly open melody of his life at the moment when he was most isolated from the physical world of human sound. That melody, that slow, stepping, inevitable melody, was heard for the first time by an audience of living, breathing, listening human beings on the evening of 7 May 1824 in the Krintlnerter Theatre in Vienna. And the man who had written it stood on the stage with his back to the crowd, still moving, still marking the rhythm with his hands, still conducting an orchestra he could not hear. In a hall whose ovation he could not hear, at the end of a performance he had felt only through the floor and through the faint trembling of the air around him. Michael Umlauf, who had been the actual working conductor that night, the one the musicians had been told to follow, had understood what was happening. He had understood, before the concert began, that Beethoven could not hear what was being played. He had understood that the old man standing beside him, mouthing the tempos, waving his arms, turning pages of a score he had written in silence, would not know when it ended unless someone showed him. And so when the final chord died and the hall broke open, when 5 ovations came, one after another, when the audience rose and wept and threw their hats and their programs into the air, Beethoven did not know. He was still facing the orchestra, still in the music, still somewhere inside the architecture he had built across 30 years, and inside the particular silence of his own skull. It was Caroline Unger, the contralto soloist, who turned him. She took hold of his arm or his shoulder. The accounts vary slightly on the exact gesture, as accounts of such moments always do, and she turned him gently toward the audience so that he could see what he could not hear. And he saw it, a hall full of people on their feet, thousands of them, waving, weeping, applauding with a force he could not measure because the sound of it was not available to him. He could only see the motion of it, the lifted hands, the open mouths, the hats in the air. What he felt in that moment, no document records precisely. What any of us would feel, looking out at a wave of human response to something we had built entirely from the inside, in silence, by an act of imagination so sustained and so disciplined it defies easy description. That is something the mind can approach only slowly, the way the eye adjusts when a lamp is brought into a dark room. But the image stays, the turned body, the conductor who could not hear the applause for his own symphony, the soprano or the contralto reaching out to give him what his ears no longer could, a view of the world responding to what he had made inside the world of his own hearing. which was now the only hearing he possessed. And the ninth was the completion of something that had begun when he was still a young man in Bonn, reading Schiller's poem On die Freude, and feeling, in the way that composers feel things before they know what to do with them, that there was music inside those words waiting to find its form. 30 years. 2 cities. The whole arc of a life spent in the gradual departure from one kind of listening and the deepening of another. The Ninth Symphony in D minor, Op. 125, the first major symphony to bring human voices into the finale, soloists and a full chorus, singing Schiller's words about joy and brotherhood and the starry sky above, was completed in 1824. And in 1972, the melody of its final movement, the Ode to Joy, the deliberately simple, stepwise, singable melody that Beethoven had approached and set aside and approached again across decades in his sketchbooks, was adopted as the official anthem of Europe by the Council of Europe, later by the European Union. The melody of a man who spent the last decade of his composing life in near total silence became the melody that a continent chose to stand for its shared aspiration. Written deaf, heard by everyone. There is something in that particular irony that is not tragic at all, if you sit with it long enough. It is almost the opposite of tragic. The melody is simple because simplicity was the point. It was written to be sung by anyone, to be grasped on first hearing, to carry across languages and borders and the differences between people who might otherwise have very little in common. A melody for the crowd, written by a man who could no longer be part of a crowd in any ordinary sense, who could no longer follow a conversation at a dinner table, or hear a friend's voice, or distinguish one voice from another in a busy street. He had retreated so far into the interior that when he finally emerged with something to offer the exterior world, what he brought back was the most outward-facing thing he ever made. The most inclusive, the most shared. And then he returned, after the premiere, to the silence. There is a particular quality to the record of his last years that is different from the drama of the Heiligenstadt crisis or the productive fury of the heroic decade. The last years are quieter and stranger and more intimate, and the primary document of them is not a symphony or a letter, but a set of notebooks. The Konversationshefte, the conversation books. From around 1818 onward, when speaking to Beethoven had become genuinely impossible, when the ear trumpets Milzel had made for him were no longer sufficient, and the gap between his hearing and the world's sound had grown too wide to bridge by any mechanical means, visitors began to write. They would come to his apartment or meet him in a cafe, and they would pick up a pencil and write their side of the exchange in a small bound notebook, and he would answer them aloud, usually aloud. Sometimes he wrote his replies too, but more often he simply spoke, which means that in the roughly 139 of these books that survive, what has been preserved is only one half of most conversations. The other half, his voice, his jokes, his answers, his arguments, his complaints, his expressions of pleasure or irritation, floated out into the rooms he inhabited and was lost. 139 books. The conversations of years. And in most of them, only the other side. There is something extraordinarily particular about that loss, not the deafness itself, which is the famous fact, but this secondary loss, the asymmetry of the archive. We have what people said to him. We have the questions, the offers, the gossip, the cafe orders, the requests from publishers, the political small talk that had to be kept carefully vague in Metternich's Vienna, where the police were listening, and a careless political remark in a notebook could have consequences. We have the notes that visitors and family members pressed into his hand. But his voice, the speaking voice, the quick rejoinder, the thing he said next, is mostly gone. And this is where the story of those books becomes darker. Because Anton Schindler, who had served as Beethoven's secretary and assistant and had made himself, over the years, indispensable and then important, took possession of the conversation books after Beethoven's death. He kept them for years. And when he eventually sold them to the Royal Library in Berlin, it became apparent, in the centuries of scholarship that followed, that an unknown number of the original books had been destroyed, and that entries in the surviving books had been altered or added outright, fabricated, in Schindler's hand. To make his own role appear more significant, to shape the image of Beethoven in ways that suited Schindler's purposes, and to settle scores with people Schindler disliked. The scale of the forgeries was not fully understood until the 20th century. But once it was understood, it changed the texture of nearly everything Schindler had ever reported about Beethoven. The quotations attributed to the composer, the stories, the explanations of what certain pieces meant. All of it now had to be weighed against the fact that the man who transmitted it had demonstrably altered the record. The most famous casualty is probably the fate knocking at the door story, the explanation of the four-note opening of the Fifth Symphony that Schindler claimed Beethoven had given him directly. It is possible it was invented. It cannot be verified. And so the story that has been repeated in 1,000 concert program notes, the story that has become the way millions of people understand one of the most famous musical gestures in the Western tradition, may have come from a man who had already proven he was willing to lie about what Beethoven said. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. What remains in the conversation books, stripped of the forgeries or held at the slight distance that uncertainty requires, is still remarkable. Shopping lists. Arguments with his housekeeper, written in cramped pencil by some frustrated visitor who could not get through to him any other way. A note from his nephew Karl, writing something an uncle might say and a nephew might answer. Instructions about the binding of a manuscript. A medical observation from one of the several doctors who attended him in his last years. The price of wine. The name of a calf, the ordinary texture of a life compressed into one half of a written exchange, in notebooks passed across a table in the silence of a city he had lived in for over 30 years and could no longer quite reach. He was lonely. This is not a romantic construction, the solitary genius, the noble isolation. It is simply what the record indicates, in the plainest terms. He was a man who had never married, who had fallen in love many times, who had written to women with a directness and vulnerability that his public persona, the difficult, unkempt, intimidating composer who poured food on waiters and moved 60 or 70 times across 35 years in Vienna, made surprising, and who had never managed to secure the domestic life that might have cushioned the deafness and the illness and the years of progressive isolation. In July of 1812, he wrote a letter, 3 sections, dated across 3 consecutive days, addressed to a woman he did not name, a woman he called only the unsterbliche Geliebte, the immortal beloved. The letter is a declaration of love, of unusual intensity, full of longing and anguish, and also a kind of tenderness that his more formal correspondence rarely shows. It was found, unsent or undelivered, among his papers after his death. And the identity of the woman he wrote it to has never been conclusively established. The leading modern candidate is Anthony Brentano, a woman of intelligence and substance whom he knew in Vienna during the years the letter was written, and the evidence assembled by scholars over decades points toward her more convincingly than toward the other candidates who have been proposed across a century and a half of biographical argument. But the argument is not settled. It may never be settled. And so Beethoven's immortal beloved remains, like the cause of his deafness and the full content of the conversation books, a gap at the center of the record. Something we circle rather than reach, something the evidence approaches without quite arriving at. He did not marry. He did not, in the ordinary sense of the word, have a family. What he had, in the years after his brother Karl died in November of 1815, was a nephew, Karl van Beethoven, Karl's son, who was then 9 years old, and for whom Beethoven fought one of the longest and bitterest legal battles of his life. He wanted sole custody. He wanted, in some version of it, to be the boy's father, or more than a father, the custodian of the boy's entire formation, the person who would shape what Karl became. And he fought Karl's mother, Johanna, through the courts of Vienna for years, winning and losing and appealing and winning again, until the matter was finally settled in his favour in 1820. The boy lived with him, or partly with him, and the guardianship was controlling in the way that only obsessive love can be controlling, not malicious, but suffocating, demanding a closeness and a gratitude that Karl, who was a young man and not a musical prodigy and not his uncle, could not entirely give. In the summer of 1826, Karl attempted to take his own life. He survived. He recovered. He eventually entered the military, and he lived for decades after Beethoven's death. But the attempt was a measure of something, of the pressure of that guardianship, of what it cost to be loved, that intensely and that imperfectly, by a man who had so little practice at ordinary human proximity, who had spent so many years at the distance that deafness creates, who had given so much of whatever tenderness he possessed to the women he could not reach and to the music that lived entirely inside him. After Karl's recovery, in the autumn of 1826, Beethoven travelled with the boy to the country estate of his brother Johann. The journey back to Vienna in an open carriage in the cold proved ruinous to his health. He arrived home in December of 1826, already seriously ill. The illness that followed was not one thing but a slow accumulation. The abdominal swelling that had troubled him in various forms across his last decade, now severe enough to require repeated drainage, the procedure performed 4 times in the months that followed, drawing off the fluid that kept accumulating in his abdomen as his liver failed. He was ill for months. He received visitors. He wrote letters or dictated them. He worked, or tried to work, or thought about the work still left to do. There were sketches, there were plans, there was always more. But the body was failing in a way that sketches could not compensate for. He died on 26 March 1827. The medical cause, established then and confirmed in broad outline by everything that has been learned since, was liver failure, cirrhosis, the accumulated damage of a life lived with abdominal illness and, very likely, significant alcohol use, though the alcohol question is complicated and cannot be reduced to simple narrative. The 2023 genomic study published in Current Biology, the study that corrected the popular account of the lead poisoning hair by establishing that the most famous lock attributed to Beethoven was actually from a woman. found in the authenticated hair samples a genetic predisposition to liver disease and evidence of a hepatitis B infection in the months before his death. Neither finding explained the deafness. The genome, examined with every tool available to modern science, could not tell us why his hearing failed. That particular question remains, as it has always been, open. At the autopsy performed after his death, his skull was opened and the inner ear structures examined. The auditory nerves were shriveled. The physical seat of what had cost him so much and given him so much was visible at last, at the end, in the body on the table, a thinning of tissue, a diminishment of structure, the biological correlate of 30 years of progressive silence. His skull and inner ear bones were examined, and then, eventually, in the complicated way of such relics, passed into the keeping of history and legend and the ordinary carelessness with which the 19th century handled such things. He died in the afternoon, or the evening. A tradition holds that there was a thunderstorm, and that at a clap of thunder he raised a clenched fist toward the sky before falling back. This story comes from a second-hand account, and it has the quality of a story that a life like his invites, the gesture of defiance at the last moment, the dramatic exit that matches the dramatic arrival. It is best understood as tradition rather than verified fact. But it is the kind of tradition that persists because it feels true to something about the man, even if the specific moment may have been quieter or simply unconscious, or nothing like a raised fist at all. 3 days after his death, on 29 March 1827, the city of Vienna accompanied him through its streets. The estimates of the crowd vary, as such estimates always do. But the range that appears most consistently in the historical record is between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Schools were closed. The streets were lined with mourners who had come to mark the passage of a man many of them had never met, who had heard his music in concert halls and in domestic performances and in the arrangements and transcriptions and street-level approximations that great music generates as it moves through a city, and who understood, with the certainty that crowds sometimes arrive at before scholars articulate it, that something had ended. Franz Schubert was among the torchbearers. Schubert, who was 30 years old that year, who had another year and a half of life ahead of him before his own death in November of 1828, who had lived in Vienna while Beethoven lived in Vienna and had, by one account, finally met the man he revered just weeks before Beethoven's death, carried a torch through the streets of the city they had both inhabited and kept the long, slow pace of the procession as it moved toward the Wreng cemetery. The poet Franz Grillparzer wrote the eulogy. Grillparzer was himself one of the important literary voices of Vienna in that period, and what he wrote for the occasion was a serious attempt to account for what had just left the world, not merely a tribute to a great musician, but a meditation on the nature of what Beethoven had been. A man who, Grillparzer wrote, had stood on the boundary of where music meets and merges with the more august temple of the universal art. And then the procession moved on, and the city settled back into itself, and the silence that Beethoven had lived in for so many of his working years was now simply the permanent condition of the world without him in it. What remains is music. And the question that the music keeps reopening, the question at the center of this long night's telling, is not really the question of how he went deaf, because that question has no answer that history has been able to confirm, only a set of plausible explanations that physicians and researchers have proposed across 2 centuries, and that a 2023 genomic study both enriched and complicated without settling. The question that the music reopens is the other one. The one underneath. How did he keep going? Not in the motivational sense, not as a lesson to be extracted and applied, not as a template for endurance that can be summarized in a few phrases and carried away. But in the literal, mechanical, physical sense, how does a man write music he cannot hear? The answer is partly the sawed-off piano legs and the wooden rod clenched between his teeth and the vibration travelling up through the wood and up through the bones of his skull to whatever remained of his capacity to feel sound rather than hear it. The answer is partly the ear trumpets that Milsel made for him, several of which still sit in the Beethoven house in Bonn, the actual objects. The actual brass and leather, the instruments a man used to try to hold on to the world of audible sound as it receded. The answer is partly the obsessive sketchbooks, the notebooks full of musical ideas, worked and reworked on paper until they reached the form he needed. The compositional process made entirely visible and entirely desk-bound when the piano and the ear could no longer collaborate. But the deepest part of the answer is something less tangible, though it is real. He had, by his early 30s, spent a lifetime building an interior architecture of sound. Every chord he had ever played, every orchestral combination he had ever heard, every interval and rhythm and dynamic that had moved him or failed to move him was present in his mind in some form that did not require his ears to activate it. Musicians call this audiation, the capacity to hear music internally, to imagine sound with the same vividness that the eye can imagine a face or a room. Every trained musician has some version of it. But Beethoven's version developed across 30-odd years of extraordinary musical experience as a performer and a composer and an improviser who had stood at the keyboard before audiences in Vienna and made them weep with music that arose from nowhere and went nowhere and was gone the moment it ended. His version of it was very deep. And when the outer world of sound closed, the inner world did not close with it. It was already there. It had always been there. What the deafness did, over the long years of its progression, was to make that inner world the only world. He retreated into it. Note by note, sketch by sketch, late sonata by late sonata, late string quartet by late quartet, he went further in. The music he wrote in that interior place, the Missa Solemnis, Op. 123, the late string quartets, the last piano sonatas, the ninth, has a quality that is not like the music he wrote when he could still hear. It is stranger. It is quieter in places and more violent in others. It has a vastness of slow movement and a structural daring that comes, perhaps, from composing in a medium where there is no feedback, where you cannot play something and immediately hear whether it works, where everything must first be trusted on paper before it can be confirmed in sound. He could not hear his own mistakes. He could only imagine his way toward rightness, and trust that what felt right in the interior would be right when the exterior world eventually played it back. And the exterior world, when it played the ninth back to him in the Krintnerter Theatre on 7 May 1824, gave him the ovation he could not hear, gave him the raised hats and the weeping and the 5 successive rounds of applause, the house responding to something it had been given that it knew was singular, even if the man who had given it was still standing with his back to them, still beating time in a private interior concert that bore only a structural relationship to the sound filling the room. Caroline Unger turned him, and he saw it. He saw all of it, a hall full of people giving him, through the only channel still available, vision, what his ears could not receive, the motion of appreciation. the kinetics of collective response. A crowd demonstrating, in the language of bodies rather than sound, that what he had made in silence had arrived, intact, in the world of sound. And if you want to understand what that moment means, not what it means as a biographical fact or as a cultural touchstone, but what it means as an experience available to the imagination of anyone lying quietly now in the dark, perhaps it helps to think about it this way. He built something inside himself. He built it out of interior sound, out of memory and imagination and the discipline of 30 years, out of a melody so simple it sounds as if it was always there, waiting to be found, out of Schiller's words about joy and about the stars above and about what human beings can share across all the things that divide them. He built it in a room no one else could enter. And then, when it was finished, he sent it out. And the world heard it, and the world is still hearing it. This is the nature of what he left. Not the biography, not the Bonn baptism, or the falsified concert poster, or the cruel abbreviation of his schooling, or the 60 apartments, or the wrecked pianos, or the bitter custody of Karl, or the immortal beloved, whose name he never wrote down, but the thing the biography was the container for. The interior architecture of sound, externalist, the late quartets playing in a rehearsal room somewhere right now, probably, the 4 instrumentalists making in real air something that exists in real air because a deaf man once made it first in the silence of his own head, in Vienna, in the winter of his life, while the city moved around him and he felt it more than heard it, through the floor, through the wood, through the bones of his face. He is gone 3 years short of 2 centuries. The auditory nerves shriveled, the liver finished, the clenched fist of a life that would seize fate by the throat finally opening. And the music plays. The passages are quiet now. There is a stillness to the end of a long night's telling. The kind of stillness that arrives not because nothing happened, but because everything that needed to happen has, at last, been said. Ludwig van Beethoven, born in Bonn, baptized on the 17th of December 1770, died in Vienna the 26th of March 1827. A man who went deaf in his late 20s and wrote his greatest music in silence and stood on a stage at the end of his greatest symphony and had to be turned by a singer's hand to see the ovation he could not hear. His music has been playing since before most of us can remember. It was there before we were, and it will be there after. The Ode to Joy melody, that deliberately simple, stepping, inevitable melody that a deaf man found waiting in Schiller's poem, rises above sporting events and political gatherings and the ordinary ceremonies of a continent that chose it as its anthem in 1972 because something in it reaches past language into something more basic. It keeps being heard. It keeps arriving. Wherever you are tonight, and I would genuinely like to know, if you feel like sharing it, where in the world you are listening from. Because that is always the thing that moves me most, the geography of who finds these stories useful. The specific cities and small towns and quiet rooms from which this kind of slow night-telling gets received. Wherever you are part of a very long line of people who have let Beethoven's music accompany them into the dark. You are not the first. You will not be the last. The architecture he built inside himself, entirely without the aid of his ears, is large enough for all of us to rest inside it. He did not resolve his mystery. The deafness remains medically unverified, its cause still debated by scientists with genomic tools he could not have imagined. The immortal beloved remains unnamed in her letter. The conversation books contain words we cannot be certain he actually said. The thunderstorm at his deathbed may have been a tradition rather than a witnessed fact. What we have of him is incomplete, and always will be. And that incompleteness is not a frustration. It is, when the night is quiet enough, a kind of comfort. The record being partial means there is always more mystery to carry into sleep. The cause of his deafness being unknown means the question does not close, and a question that does not close is a companion, the kind you can take to bed and not need to resolve before morning. He lived with much larger unresolved questions than any of us will have to. He found a way to work inside them. He found a way to make, out of the very fact of not hearing, something that the hearing world could not stop listening to. You have done enough for one night. Wherever your mind has been travelling through this telling, through Bonn and Vienna, through the sawed-off piano legs and the unsent letter, and the ovation for a symphony its composer could not hear, you can let it rest now. The questions will be there in the morning if you want them. The music will be there in the morning. Tonight there is only the stillness and the dark, and the long, slow breath of sleep coming on. You are moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off,